For this evening, following my remarks, we'll hear from Cardinal Collins, and then Don Newman will introduce the candidates and moderate our debate. To close the evening, His Eminence will return with some final thoughts and a closing prayer. And we hope to accomplish all of this and have you on your way by about 9:15 tonight. The candidates have also been invited to host a meet and greet following the debate at tables in the lobby. If you'd like to say hello, you're more than welcome to stop on by. Now, in June of this year, Cardinal Collins invited each of the party leaders to attend tonight or to send their preferred candidate to the debate we're having this evening. To remain nonpartisan in our planning, we committed to follow the Federal Leaders Debate Commission guidelines to determine which parties were invited. On September 16th, the Commission announced that the People's Party of Canada would be included in the Federal Leaders Debate, so they'll be with us tonight in addition to candidates from the Greens, Conservative, Liberal, and NDP parties. Here's to a great night, and at this time, please welcome the Archbishop of Toronto, His Eminence, Cardinal Thomas Collins.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Whether here in Toronto or in church halls, offices, or homes across the country, you are most welcome. Throughout this federal election campaign, we have shared resources on Catholic social teaching on a number of relevant topics. And tonight we listen with respectful attention to the representatives of the political parties. In any debate, the hardest part for us may be that we're in the audience and don't have the microphone. We are forced to listen to positions we do not agree with and feel the urge to offer a rebuttal or a correction. While tempting, that is not our role this evening. We're here to listen and to reflect on the positions of those who are asking for our vote as they seek to lead our country. Our great responsibility during this campaign comes on October the 21st, when we cast our vote. I pray that when that moment comes, we will follow our conscience. Throughout life's journey, it is our conscience which guides us. Conscience is a bit like a GPS guidance system in a car. It is meant to help us to get from where we are to where we need to go.
Can you clarify today whether backbench MPs will be able to introduce motions or bills on issues touching on abortion or same-sex marriage, and if you would allow a free vote for both your caucus and cabinet on such matters?
Well, I've always been very clear, and nothing has changed for our party on this issue. This is the same, we operate under the same policies as the previous Conservative government under Stephen Harper, which is that individual MPs have the right to express themselves on matters of conscience, but that a Conservative government will not reopen these divisive social issues. And so that is our position. That has always been our position. Canadians can have confidence that these issues will not be reopened under a future Conservative government.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our moderator for tonight's debate, Mr. Don Newman.
Well, good evening, everybody, and let me add my welcome to the debate. It is my pleasure, of course, to be your moderator tonight for this discussion of issues that matter to Canada's Catholic community. Now, without further ado, let me share the rules for our debate. Candidates were not given questions in advance. Our debaters chose lots to determine where they will stand on the stage, and they chose lots to determine the order in which they will speak in each round of the debate. And we'll begin the evening and we'll conclude the evening with statements from the candidates, and I'll ensure, well, at least I'll try to ensure, that no one goes over their time. That could be the biggest job of the evening, but anyway, I'll try it. Now, in addition to opening and closing statements, there will be 5 debate segments, each covering a particular topic. All the topics are getting equal time, and every topic in the debate will be introduced with a video featuring a different leader from the Catholic community. That person will ask the first question for each topic. These videos will be projected on our big screen up here, so we'll all be able to see and hear them. Now, I know we're passionate about the issues. However, I would ask you to refrain from anything that might disrupt from the flow of the evening. Standing, shouting, slogans, catcalls, your favorite hymn. As the Cardinal said, let's be respectful to one another. Now, we have a very tight schedule and hope to wrap up the evening by about 9:15. So to move us along, I ask you to hold your applause except at the beginning and the end of the debate. And let's remember the Cardinal's words about political civility and try to stifle any outbursts of displeasure that may gurgle inside us. Now, I'm going to introduce the debaters in alphabetical order, and remember that this is the appropriate time to give them a rousing round of applause. So, if you are ready, representing the Conservative Party in the riding of Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan in Alberta, Garnett Genius. Representing the NDP in the riding of Hamilton Centre, Matthew Green. Representing the People's Party in the riding of Cambridge, David Millard Haskell. Representing the Liberal Party in the riding of Vaughan Woodbridge, Francesco Sorbera. And representing the Green Party in the riding of Don Valley East, Dan Turcott. So let's begin with opening statements. Each debater has 2 minutes. And we begin with Dan Turcott from the Green Party. Dan, please.
Thank you. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. I'd like to thank the Catholic Church for having us all here and for this opportunity. I'd like to thank the organizers, Neil, wherever you may be. His Eminence, Cardinal Collins, thank you very much for this opportunity. We really, really appreciate it. You know, I personally am most excited to be here because of the framing of tonight's conversation. It was based around compassion and cooperation, which is a personal tenet of mine and one of the reasons that I'm running tonight, that I'm here at all. You know, that compassion, that cooperation creates opportunities. It creates opportunities for our children, for our families, for all of us. And I actually have a new family. I have an 11-month-old daughter, and she's why I'm here, because I'm really concerned about her future, more than concerned. You know, the only way to guarantee a good future for all of our kids is to find that cooperation and to look for leaders that look for ways to solve problems, new ways to solve problems. Some of you may have seen the Green Party ad campaign from the mouths of babes. It's a series of commercials with kids holding cards with messages like, you have to tell the truth or people won't believe you anymore. It works best when we build it together. And at the very end, it says we should expect from our leaders what we expect of our kids. I actually wrote and directed that campaign because that's where my heart sits. That's what I think we need to do. And so I'm looking forward to some really good conversation tonight. But like many of you, I'm really tired of a lot of the political discourse that happens, squabbling over power instead of cooperating to govern, which is the original intent for our democracy. I'm also frustrated that so many of us feel that we have to vote one of two ways or our vote will be wasted. Voting strategically, we have to vote for one of two parties. Shouldn't every one of our votes count? What if every vote could count? Then would our votes change? Well, our votes should count, and we are all here in the hopes of being public servants so that we can represent you. So I hope you all remember that tonight, that we are not here to take power, but we are here in service.
Okay, Dan, thank you very much. That's your
Thank you.
2 minutes.
Thank you.
Now, David Haskell from the People's Party. David.
Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm David Haskell. I have the honor of representing the People's Party tonight, and I'll begin that task by briefly detailing who we are and what we stand for. The People's Party, also known as the PPC, is the newest political party, and we're also the fastest growing in the history of Canada. Our candidates and supporters are of diverse races, ethnicities, and religions, and what unites us is our belief that Canada is unapologetically good, and its core values, rooted in the Western and Judeo-Christian tradition, have made it so. Now, you may find it curious that such a basic introduction needs to be made for the PPC, but it arises from the fact that the media really doesn't give us much coverage, and when it does, it tends to be very one-sided. Related to media coverage, you may have heard the leader of my party, Maxime Bernier, has been excluded from several televised debates. Perhaps what's more shocking is this: not one of the other federal party leaders has spoken out against that censorship. In fact, a few have repeatedly and openly encouraged it. In our opening statement tonight, it was requested that we touch on how each party can raise the bar on respectful political discourse. Let me tell you what immediately comes to my mind. It's this: if you truly want to encourage respectful political discourse, a great first step would be letting your opponent speak. It seems to me our democracy depends on it. And consider this: if the leader of a party is willing to censor a political rival because of ideological differences, can you ever believe that that same leader will defend your right to speak when you happen to disagree with the party? Thank you.
And now, Francesco Sorbera from the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. Thank you, Most Reverend Eminence Cardinal Collins and everyone gathered this evening. It's a wonderful evening to be here, and it's wonderful to come downtown Toronto from Vaughan. I'd like to start off with a personal prayer, if we all can. I am replacing Philomena Tassi, the Member of Parliament, a Liberal candidate from Hamilton. She was scheduled to be here. One of her family members is in a hospice at this moment. I spoke to her last night. We shared prayers over the phone. So if we can all take a moment sometime during this evening to also say a prayer for Philomena and her family, I think that would be really nice. This evening I'm proud to be here. I'm proud to be here as a Knights of Columbus member, as a parishioner of St. Clare of Assisi in Vaughan. I'm proud to be here as the co-chair of the Holy See Friendship Group in Ottawa with Mr. Genius. I'm proud to be here as someone who's raised in the values of Catholicism. I'm proud to follow and respect and listen to on a weekly basis Pope Francis, his call for leadership focused on the family, social justice initiatives, and His Holiness's dear call to fight the climate emergency. I would like to thank Cardinal Collins on his leadership and the entire Archdiocese on their leadership in the Syrian refugee file. That was a telling moment in Canada's history of our compassion, of our inclusivity, and our voice in the world, which we know these days is oh so important. Tonight I'd also like to say hi to my two daughters, Eliane and Natalia, at home, who are both kids in the Catholic school system here in Ontario and are being great in the values that I was, the values of compassion, inclusivity, caring for one's neighbor, the values of the Jesuits. I have such deep, profound respect for His Holiness. What is he advocating for these days in terms of social justice, caring for our neighbors, and being an inclusive country and an inclusive world? Thank you very much.
Now, Garnett Genius from the Conservative Party. Garnett.
Well, thank you, Cardinal Collins, Neil, and all of you for your presence here tonight. Catholic social teaching is rooted in two concepts: solidarity and subsidiarity. In solidarity, we assume responsibility for the common good of the entire human family. We recognize human dignity as inherent to all human beings. Your dignity is the result of your creation, and therefore not dependent on gender, level of development, level of dependency, income, race, sexual orientation, or even partisan affiliation. All human beings are made in the image of God, and as policymakers and as individuals, we must treat one another accordingly. Solidarity is the key to better policy and to more constructive politics, but we also must hold each other accountable. So if I call anyone a hypocrite or a brood of vipers tonight, I hope it will be appreciated that I am quoting words that Jesus also used. And I hope that if I get too exuberant, the Cardinal will hear my confession afterwards. Friends, subsidiarity is the idea that better decisions are made when the creative energy of the whole community is harnessed, so that decisions should be made at the lowest level, closest to the people as possible. Better local governments than national governments, and better individuals, families, and communities than governments acting on their own. Our party believes in these two core principles. We have a program that seeks solidarity through subsidiarity, tax relief targeted to the most vulnerable, and stronger partnerships between government and civil society on poverty and on refugees. To realize this vision, we will cut government subsidies to well-connected corporations and pass savings on to low-income Canadians through a cut to the lowest marginal tax rate and an increase to the seniors' tax credit. We will lift the cap on the number of privately sponsored refugees. We will end this government's values test policy, which seeks to deny charitable organizations equal access if they are pro-life. We will reopen the Office of Religious Freedom, and we will protect our freedoms here at home. Thank you.
And finally, Matthew Green from the NDP.
To Cardinal Thomas Collins and to all faith leaders present, to the administration and staff of the Catholic Archdiocese of Toronto, to our moderator, my colleagues present, and all parishioners both here and online, good evening. As a very proud NDP candidate from Hamilton Centre, I am grateful to join you in this discussion on the federal election from a Catholic perspective. I am here because of the hundreds of precariously homeless and vulnerable residents in my community who line up around the block waiting at the doorsteps of de Mazenod's door, where Father Tony and St. Patrick's Parish provide more than a hot meal. They provide dignity and respect, and perhaps most importantly, a sense of community and belonging for those who have felt forsaken by society. I am here tonight as a proud New Democrat, knowing that we will not agree on all the issues that are discussed, but because I know that through observing solidarity of my Catholic friends and neighbors in Hamilton Centre, from what they do in their kindness between the Sundays, that how they act out their Catholic social teachings on all matters of human dignity and the common good, and in my namesake, Matthew 25:40, for in truth I tell you, insofar as you did to this one of my least of my brothers or sisters of mine, you did to me. And that there is more in common and compatible with our social democratic principles as New Democrats and the great deal of the social teachings of the Catholic faith than in aspects of our respective beliefs from which we disagree. And on those points of disagreements and respectable political discourse, I'd like to paraphrase the late, great James Baldwin, that we can disagree and still love one another, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity. I look forward to this fruitful discussion and thank you for the platform provided here this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you all candidates. Now let's move along to our first topic, and that topic is poverty. And it will be introduced on the screen behind us, where we'll get our first question. So, roll the tape, please.
I'm Louise Coutu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul for the Toronto Central Council. Every year, our 1,300 volunteers make 65,000 home visits to the people trying to make ends meet. We offer them fellowship and emergency financial assistance. We also house more than 250 people at any given time. We're here at Mary's Home, one of our many shelters in the Greater Toronto Area. For our clients in need, housing affordability is one of their greatest stresses. A recent report found that someone renting an average one-bedroom apartment in Toronto must earn more than $57,000 per year to pay for their housing and other financial needs. And the study found that life isn't much cheaper in the suburbs. Safe, clean, affordable housing is key to human dignity. But these prices are out of reach for many people. We saw this when the 2016 Canadian census showed 22,000 people living in Canada's shelters. How would your party provide a preferential option for those experiencing poverty, particularly in regards to affordable housing?
Thank you, Louise. Now again, our speaking order for each topic was selected through lots drawn before the debate. And you'll each have 1 minute to respond before we have open discussion candidates. So first, Garnett, let's start with you from the Conservative Party.
Well, thank you. Sometimes Catholics feel like they have to choose between their concern for poverty and their concern for life, family, and freedom. But I believe that we must be unhyphenated Catholics, fully engaged with questions of poverty and life and family and freedom. Conservatives do not believe that the solution to every problem is a government program. Indeed, many government programs are most used by the well-connected, paid for through a tax burden that falls heavily on those who are already struggling. We have proposed tax relief targeted specifically to Canadians in need. Every personal income tax reduction ever made by a Conservative Party of Canada government was particularly targeted to low-income and middle-class Canadians. Now, on housing, we have made significant investments in Housing First homelessness programs. We will review the mortgage stress test, which has been imposed by the Liberals and put housing out of reach for many Canadians. We will bring in 30-year mortgages for first-time home buyers. Our approach respects subsidiarity, so we have increased and guaranteed support to provinces and local governments while always respecting their competence and jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you, Garnett. Now, Matthew Green from the NDP. Matthew.
As a former city councillor, the most haunting call I would get would be from somebody facing imminent eviction. It would haunt me because I know that I would call the shelters and I wouldn't be able to find them a place to sleep. I would take that home with me. And it would haunt me to a moat because I knew that tomorrow I would probably get another call. Which is why, as a New Democrat, I am so very proud of providing this country a national housing strategy that includes the construction of 500,000 units over 10 years. The average income in my riding is $47,000. So we know that we have to be able to provide people with immediate supports, which is why we are proposing providing a $5,000 rent subsidy that will allow them to be able to be finding immediate places to live. We will also make life affordable for families by providing affordable housing and lowering the household bills on hydro and home energy retrofits. Oh, I see that red sign coming up. It comes quick.
Time does fly. Dan Turcotte.
Thank you. There we go. If we want fundamental changes, then we have to change things in the way we govern fundamentally. We need to make safe, secure, affordable housing a fundamental human right. The Green Party thinks that it is a human right. There is enough housing, there is enough money, there is enough in Canada that people should not be without housing. Small tax cuts aren't going to be enough if people make half of what it takes to afford to live in these places. But poverty is a systematic problem. It's not just one thing or another. It's a lot of things tied together. It's low wages. It's an uncertain job market. It's shortage of housing is the biggest one, but even social services like childcare. We're going through that now, looking for daycares. There are a bunch of things, but there are also several biases. There's my card. Race, gender, the effects of colonization. We need to look at all of these things, and we need to respect the rights of people.
David Haskell from the People's Party.
Thank you. Housing prices, like any other product, go up when supply is low and demand is high. But increasing supply is specifically a provincial jurisdiction. The province and municipalities have the power to say where a building can happen and how much. One of the only things that the federal government could do to get home prices lower is to reduce overall demand. And the research says that the most effective way of doing that in Canada would be to lower immigration levels. And this is something that the People's Party will do. Research from the Conference Board of Canada, Simon Fraser University, and most recently, a study out of UBC showed when immigration levels are too high, housing prices go up. The studies also show that it's mostly the economically vulnerable, for example, new immigrants already in Canada, who feel the greatest negative effects of this phenomenon.
Thank you. Now, Francisco Cervera from the Liberal Party. Francisco.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to the volunteers at the St. Paul Society. Poverty, housing affordability, affordable housing, our record speaks for itself. 900,000 Canadians have been lifted out of poverty for the last 4 years. We brought in the first ever Poverty Reduction Act, which is now law. Poverty in Canada is declining and at near lowest levels in generations. We brought in the first ever National Housing Strategy committing $40 billion over 10 years, real investments after a period of time where we saw cuts to social programs in Canada and tax cuts for our wealthiest. We committed in our first ever National Housing Strategy to lift over 500,000 Canadian families from housing need and cut chronic homelessness by 50%, and we are ahead of schedule. We have work to do, but we are on the right path. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, let's discuss this for a moment. Both the Greens and the NDP have in their platforms some form of universal income. I didn't hear you specifically referring to it, either of you. So let me start with you, Garnett. Let me start with Dan. Is there a universal income that takes care of this problem of housing? And does it go over $57,000 a year? Because that sounds like a pretty high universal income. But apparently, based on what we've learned, if you don't make that in Toronto anyway, you don't get a house. You don't get an apartment.
It doesn't start there. And by the way, universal income was actually where I was going to go right before the red card got me. So thank you for giving us the opportunity. Universal income, and it's a livable wage. We need to determine what that livable wage is going to be. But as I said, this is more of poverty is a holistic, multifaceted issue. It has to do with jobs. It has to do with education. So we also believe in educational subsidies so that fewer people need to be in a situation where they can't afford to pull themselves out of this poverty. But yes, a universal basic income and guaranteeing housing as a human right. If you put those two things together, people will have a place to live, and it gives them a starting point.
And Matthew, does that fit in what the NDP is doing? Because you also talked about a $5,000 housing subsidy. Would that be part of an universal income?
The portable rent subsidy is something that would allow people today, effective tomorrow, to be able to keep up for the ever-increasing costs of rent. You'll know that in my city, particularly in my Hamilton, we have a situation right now where ODSP and Ontario Works and minimum wage have all stayed the same. And year after year, the rents go up in record numbers. So while we tout having record building permits and condos dotting the sky, the reality is that we also have record number of people living in tents. That I have actually visited around the world refugee camps that have more dignity than some of the people that are living in our own community. But we need to be very clear that this is not a conversation of immigration, that there are 8,000 people on our housing wait list today that have nothing to do with the people who are coming today or tomorrow. So we have to be very careful about that rhetoric that pit newcomers versus people who are already living in poverty in this country.
David, you shook your head.
Yeah, well, as I say, the people who suffer the most right now because of this affordability and housing crisis are newcomers. And if we truly do care about the people who are already in Canada, then we need to address it. And what my colleagues on this stage have been talking about, subsidies, more government spending, these are Band-Aid solutions. We actually have to look at the research that, again, has come out of UBC most recently that says the level of immigration we have right now is just too high. And we can't depend on the provinces to increase supply, so we have to decrease the demand. And this doesn't have anything to do with race or ethnicity.
When
it's
they
getting
come,
the numbers right.
Don't they create a demand when they're here? And wouldn't that then lead to more houses being built?
Well, currently the research that, again, came out of Simon Fraser University shows that currently immigrants are about double the unemployment rate. And currently they are actually, it's a $5,000 cost per immigrant loss to our tax system.
Immigrants are not a loss to our
No,
society.
no, they aren't.
Immigrants
We all
helped
know
build
immigrants who are
our
fantastic.
society, and in that frame, you created very problematic, and I'd love to see your citations on that, because we know that the supply and the demand curves are not left up to the market, that the market is at the city level in particular through land use. We are seeing massive urbanizations that have nothing to do necessarily with immigration, but migration, because I'll tell you, most of the people who are moving into Hamilton Centre that are causing the gentrification are people who have already been priced out of Toronto, and that has to do with speculators, and certainly there are some foreign speculators, but they're not the immigrants that you're framing right now. These are people who are buying our real estate market up for the value and not the purpose of safe and dignified places for people to live.
Garnett.
You know, I think it's important to respond to some of the things that Francesco said in his opening, which, with respect, simply aren't true. The Conservative record is of lowering the GST, lowering the lowest marginal tax rate, and raising the base personal exemption. We brought in direct payments to parents as an alternative to a government-run childcare program, and as a result, poverty went down dramatically by 3% roughly during a recession. Now, Francesco has a talking point which says Conservatives want to, quote, raise taxes on the wealthy. So I would like to ask you, Francesco, I say that's not true. If you say Conservatives have raised taxes on the wealthy, then tell us which taxes, when, and by how much.
Well, you may be surprised to know it's Francesco's turn. Go ahead.
Thank you, Don, and great to see the debate, and hopefully for everyone here tonight, it's substantive debate and gives you answers and looks and insights. Frankly, Garnett, your universal tax cut that you guys have brought forward benefits the wealthiest in Canada. I'm an economist. Have a graduate degree. I worked on Bay Street and Wall Street. Yes, I'm into the PPC party candidate. My parents were immigrants to this country. They came here. They work hard. They sacrificed. They raised 3 boys. A family of 7 came through Pier 21 in the 1950s, and we worked, and we're proud Canadians, much like the immigrants are coming through here. I will stand up for immigrants all the time. I will follow Pope Francis's lead. I will respect and make sure this country is always inclusive, always compassionate, and always welcoming, because that is the Canada I know. That is the Canada I was raised in. Garnett, your tax cuts, your policies, sending checks to millionaires, which is a complete fact. Your tax cut today benefits the most wealthiest. Look at the numbers. Our raise in the basic personal exemption amount, which is proposed in our platform, takes away 700,000 people from the tax rolls. Our increasing old age security benefit, when people hit 75 by 10%, lifts 20,000 people out of poverty, 20,000 seniors. 900,000 people in Canada have been lifted out of poverty in the last 4 years. We've created 1.2 million new jobs, and
Don,
that's the record I've
All right.
You guys had anemic economic growth for 10 years, and that's the fact.
Okay, Francesco, the time is up. I want to ask you one question, though, if I may, David. When you say that the number of immigrants arriving is more than to satisfy the unemployment rate.
Right.
But the fact is that all the immigrants that are arriving are not coming here to work. In fact, most of them are families, maybe only one, and so maybe it's like 25% of the immigrants arriving are actually going to take a job.
Currently, it's 26%. 26%
Well, that's
of immigrants.
Okay, I'm out of percentage,
yeah.
but that's my point.
Yeah, yeah. But I
Math
need to,
wasn't my major. I couldn't help that.
Well, I'd like to respond to the mischaracterization of my party's policies. The first thing that I would mention is that one of the people who helped design our immigration policy is an immigrant from Calcutta and a practicing Muslim. And he said that what we need to do is make sure that we abandon political correctness and stick as close as we can to the facts. Because if we truly want to be compassionate and solve the problems that are in Canada, we have to be willing to talk about difficult issues. And again, this is not an issue related to race, ethnicity. It's about numbers. And right now, we are bringing into Canada, every 3 years, the population equal to Nova Scotia. And we just cannot have that for our affordable housing. It also is problematic.
I'm way over time, and I let everybody go long, which means that I'm now in trouble. But we're going to go on to the next topic. Let us go on to the next topic, which is religious freedom. And our first question will again come from the screen. So roll the tape, please.
Hello, I am Carl Létu, National Director of the Catholic Near East Welfare Association. Kenewa provides important support to Middle Eastern Christians and Eastern Catholics worldwide. Although you don't see it in the news often, Christians are facing violence around the world. During my travel to the Middle East, I've heard my share of disturbing stories from families that have experienced firsthand violence, fear, and hatred for the simple fact that they are Christian. This is why I stand here at the Good Shepherd Chaldean Catholic Parish in North York. Many families have come from Iraq and they are worried about their relative remaining in their homeland. They are among 327 million Christians for whom having their religious freedom violated by discrimination and persecution is a daily reality. Violence and persecution against any religious group is wrong. Yet Christians are the victim of 75% of the world's religiously motivated violence. In pure numbers, Christians are the most persecuted group in the world. Any violation of religious freedom, as you will agree, must be taken seriously. If elected, how would your party respond to the global problem of Christian persecution?
Thank you, Carl. Now again, the candidates have 1 minute to respond based on the randomly drawn order. And this time we're going to start with David Haskell from the People's Party.
Oh, thank you. In the spring of this year, I'm corroborating what we just heard. The British Foreign Office released a study on religious persecution. It found that Christians are the most persecuted group in the world. Christians in Muslim-majority countries fare the worst. In deference to current cultural prejudice against Christianity, most political leaders have turned a blind eye to the violent persecution of Christians that they're experiencing worldwide. A People's Party government will not continue this willful blindness. We have an explicit refugee policy that gives priority to the most persecuted minorities. And we will also protect the rights of Christians and other believers here at home. Our current Liberal government actively discriminates against Christians and people of conservative moral convictions. We saw it with the requirement to support abortion in writing to receive summer job funding. The People's Party is the only federal party with a policy to end that discrimination.
Next is Garnett. Garnett.
I move the motion in the House of Commons to repeal the values test. So maybe check our record on that. But on the point of religious freedom, my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. My wife's parents are Christians from Pakistan. So I would love to see this be a nonpartisan issue, but unfortunately, that is not the case here in Canada. Indeed, the Liberals eliminated Canada's Office of Religious Freedom, and it was only Conservatives who voted to leave that in place. Liberals particularly refused to recognize Christian persecution. They finally acknowledged the genocide of Yazidis in Iraq and Syria, but they still refuse to recognize the genocide of Christians who were treated in the same way. We will never express admiration for China's political model. We will not appoint an ambassador whose company led a corporate retreat a few miles from a concentration camp, and we will not let Canada's pension fund invest in surveillance technology in those same concentration camps. Conservatives will restore the Office of Religious Freedom, restore the ambassadorial post, get rid of the values test, and defend the rights of all persecuted minorities, including Christians.
Dan.
The Green Party believes that everyone everywhere has the right to religious freedom unquestionably, and that no one should ever tell anyone else how they should worship or what they have to believe. We think that the best way to stand behind that is to strengthen Canada's role in promoting peace and global cooperation. It's our role here, so it should be our role abroad as well. We think that international stability rests on all nations being able to provide their people with basic needs and security. Again, back to the basic needs. These are articulated in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. Our commitment is to expanding Canada's international aid, and we think that that will help those facing religious persecution everywhere in the world, and we believe that it is our responsibility to help everyone who's facing that persecution.
Francesco.
Thank you, Dom. I attended Mass this Sunday morning at the Church of the Good Shepherd, the cathedral, and I go there for the feast days. And my riding has a large number of Iraqi Christians, both Chaldean and Assyrian, and I've gotten to know them very well and understand and I've heard their stories of being persecuted in Iraq and as a Christian of the Middle East. I stand with them. I am their advocate. and we must always do more. I go there on the feast days to be with them, and I count them as my friends. We as a government, I'm not going to be partisan on this, but we advocate for the sponsorship of refugees, whether it's privately sponsored refugees to 20,000 by 2020, increase the caps on the sponsorship agreement holders to facilitate more private sponsorships, and double the number of refugees and protected persons. Also, Garnett, in all due respect, the Office of Religious Freedom was an ineffective office. Thank you.
And Matthew, please.
Religious persecution of Christians and other religious minorities across the world is a tragedy that we can do more to address. New Democrats believe that we could be stronger voices for peace and justice on the world stage by participating in peacekeeping, working democratically to end conflicts and persecution, and accepting refugees from places that persecute citizens for their faith, ethnicity, and political participation. But we also have to look domestically. I am very worried by the legislation like Bill 21 in Quebec that is an example of state-sponsored discrimination against religious minorities. When religious minorities are targeted, all of our rights are at risk, and we need to stand in solidarity with our fellow citizens. The best way to protect religious freedom is loud and active political participation in our democratic process to tell lawmakers that you won't stand for the erosion of our human rights. Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about this for a few minutes. Let me start, Garnett, with you. Did you say that your wife's parents are Pakistani Christians?
They were both born in Karachi, yes.
And as I understand it, Christians in Pakistan can face the death penalty if they're considered to be insulting the majority religion. And I'm wondering, is there anything that the Canadian government can do to help Pakistani Christians specifically?
Well, there's a blasphemy law which has perverse outcomes for Christians and other minorities. It's a big problem. The Office of Religious Freedom ran a program in Pakistan, one of many programs around the world, that partnered with the Aga Khan Foundation in the development of pro-pluralism books, trying to engage the education system with materials that would help people think about the role that minorities play in the country's history. These are the kind of actions promoting solidarity. My Liberal colleague says the Office of Religious Freedom was ineffective. I think, with due respect, we need to go beyond words of solidarity to look at the reality of solidarity. The Office of Religious Freedom was only a $5 million office. It ran programs all over the world. It won praise all over the world. Father Deacon Andrew Bennett was so effective in running on-the-ground programs that moved the ball forward in places like Sri Lanka, Nigeria, Pakistan, and a number of countries where the programs weren't even published because they were working behind sort of an iron curtain. So it's very surprising and disappointing to hear Francesco say these negative things about the office, and I look forward to bringing the office back when we're in government.
Now, well, I suppose I should give you a chance to answer that.
Yes.
But not too long.
Two quick points. Canada will always and ever be an outspoken advocate for human rights and call on countries to abide by international standards, and will always be at the table. One thing that's interesting that Garnett hasn't raised is the proposed $2.2 billion cut in foreign aid that Andrew Scheer announced. Now, I'm just going to read a quote, what was stated. Fundamentally, you're talking about immunizing fewer children, more mothers dying in childbirth, less potable water, and more refugees suffering in conflict zones. That is the foreign policy, or proposed foreign policy, of Andrew Scheer. Shame.
I'd love to be able to respond to that.
Well, you've had one turn. If we have time, I'll come back to you. You're next, yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out to the crowd tonight what you hear and what you don't hear. When my colleague from the Green Party was describing the persecution, he used Christian once, and then he moved on to minorities. Christian was no longer mentioned. When we heard Don saying that in Pakistan, the majority religion persecutes Christians, he didn't want to say Muslim or Islam. The problem is that political correctness is getting in the way of truth, and it's getting in the way of solutions. And we see this again and again in what's happening with the persecution of Christians. Unless we are willing to face these problems and actually say what's going on, we can't move toward solutions. In fact, in that study that I mentioned, the British official who had done the study said that political correctness is actually leading to greater persecution of Christians. We see this in our own country where Elizabeth May, when interviewed by a reporter, and she's asked, who's your hero? She says, Jesus Christ. And then she says, oh, I apologize. I shouldn't have said that. She said she shouldn't say it because in order to be inclusive, she cannot promote Christianity. What kind of double standard is that? What kind of bizarre idea is it that every other faith can speak its name, but Christianity can't? And this is a problem that not just hurts us here, but hurts Christians worldwide. We need to be able to speak the name of Jesus, we need to be able to speak the name of Christianity, and we need to address these problems head on.
I'm glad that everybody is following my admonition not to applaud during the debate, only at the beginning and the end. Thank you for following the rules. Dan, it's your turn, but I want you to also discuss, you can obviously respond to that, but Bill 21, and Matthew raised it and he can talk about it after you. Bill 21, it seems to me, is not aimed at Christians particularly, but we're kind of cut in the slipstream. Crucifixes now, you can't wear a crucifix if you're a teacher or so forth. Is this just an increasing secularization of society, maybe aimed at immigrants and Muslims and so forth, but a dangerous way to go?
Interestingly enough, I don't see it as secularization. I actually think that by my definition, secularization would actually be inclusion, and that if somebody chooses to be, they can be, and if somebody chooses to be Catholic or Muslim, they can be. By the way, just to respond to my colleague, one really, really good way to help take care of the Christians that are being persecuted is to increase immigration and let them come here, and we would love to have them. We would welcome them all indeed, with open arms.
That is our policy. That is our policy.
As well as any persecuted Muslims and any persecuted Hindus and
Dan
Buddhists
has the floor.
And anyone else. So I actually and the Green Party think that it's important that everybody have equal rights. And see, the interesting thing with the concept of democracy is that in order for us to have the freedom to act the way that we feel we need to act, we have to allow the same thing to other people. Or as they say on the farm, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We need to learn to let people live, and we need to be allowed to live. And I think that needs to be a universal trait for everyone.
Matthew. Bill 21, you alluded to, well, you mentioned it. Do you see it now as sort of an increasing secularization that catches everybody, or is just immigrant? I don't think it's a good idea either way. Let me put that on the record. Even if it's just immigrant aimed, I think that's wrong. But I wonder what you think if there's a wider implication to it.
Well, I think the wider implication is the rise of right-wing populist rhetoric that allows politicians the space to dehumanize people in our public spheres. And we only have to look to how many times the leader of our party, Jagmeet Singh, has been dehumanized for expressing his faith. And so I find it quite ironic to hear the type of right-wing rhetoric that would at one time admonish refugees and at another time talk about religious freedoms. You can't have both. You're either for freedoms for everybody or freedoms for nobody. That's the Canada that I like to live in.
Don, if I can just respond to Francesco's challenge to me, because he hasn't answered my questions, but I want to answer his.
20 seconds.
Okay. Our foreign aid policy is to take money away from countries who don't need it and give more to the countries who need it the most. Now, you don't fight poverty by giving money to countries that are not poor. When our aid dollars end up in Italy and Turkey and Argentina, we want to give more to sub-Saharan Africa. We want to give more to those who are most in need. That is our policy. That is a more compassionate and more effective policy.
I have to give you the same amount of time,
A very quick
and then we're moving on.
A very quick retort. I'm of Canadian of Italian heritage. My parents immigrated from Italy. Under Stephen Harper, when there was an earthquake in Italy, $5 million or so was helped to match donations from the community to rebuild. Are you saying that was an incorrect decision? Under our government, the community raised over $2 million, and an announcement was made to help rebuild Amatrice, with some of those funds also given to us from the Canadian government, but matching the community. Are you saying tonight to the Italian community, the 1.5 million, 6 million Canadians of Italian heritage, it was wrong for the community to go out and raise money for affected areas? It was wrong for Stephen Harper to provide a matching donation, and it was wrong for our government to do the same thing when our community helped out back home? Was it wrong? Yes or no?
Francesco, I'm happy to answer your
I'll let
question
you
again.
answer, just quickly.
Happy to answer it again. Let me be very clear that there are certain categories of spending which Andrew Scheer was very clear we would continue to consider proposals from all over the world, including proposals promoting pluralism and democracy, and there's uncoded categories in there. So absolutely there's nothing wrong with fundraising, and absolutely the government should be engaged in things like disaster relief. But when we have coded grants directly to countries that are already doing relatively well, let's use that money to help those who are actually the world's poorest. That is using your head and your heart at the same time.
And let us use our head and heart on our third topic now. And that is life issues. Can we hear the question, please?
I'm Sister John Mary from the Sisters of Life, a community of women who seek to foster a culture of life in Toronto and throughout North America. We're here at our ministry center in downtown Toronto. Much of our work involves supporting pregnant women who are alone and need help. We also assist women who have suffered after abortion to heal and regain hope. With 94,000 abortions having been reported in Canada in 2017 alone, we know that this is an issue which impacts a great number of women. However, many people are surprised to learn that Canada hasn't had an abortion law in 30 years. Polls consistently tell us that while Canadians have differing views on abortion, most feel that there should be some restrictions in place, such as banning late-term or sex-selective abortions. However, despite the desire of Canadians for protective restrictions, none of the major political parties want to pass an abortion law. Neither do they seem to want to provide appropriate healthcare supports to those at the end of life. Most people at the end of life cite pain and loneliness as their primary concerns. We know that palliative care can address these issues, yet only 15% of Canadians receive palliative care in the home, and only a third of Canadians have access to any palliative care at all. Instead, there are many proponents lobbying to expand the criteria to make it easier for Canadians to plan their own deaths. Our Catholic faith views every human life as sacred, made in the image of God. We believe that every person deserves to be upheld, protected, and accompanied towards life-affirming decisions. If elected, how would your party tackle these issues and defend the rights of all Canadians from conception to natural death?
Well, thank you, Sister John Mary. 1 minute each for the debaters. Matthew Green, you're first.
Our position on women's reproductive self-determination is clear, and we believe that the right of people afflicted by incurable and painful illnesses to choose to end their lives. We also believe in ensuring that the conscious rights of medical professionals are protected when it comes to medical assistance in dying, and in a comprehensive approach to palliative care that improves the end of life across the country. New Democrats passed a motion with an all-party support in 2014 calling for a national palliative care strategy and pushed for its inclusion in the scope of C14. It remains a part of our vision for comprehensive, head-to-toe, universal public health care. Thank you.
And now, Francesco, your turn.
Thank you, Don. When it comes to women's reproductive rights, I personally support a woman's right to choose. Every party has taken the same position on that, and from my understanding, no party will be reopening the debate on a woman's right to choose in Canada. And if my understanding is correct, that was also the position taken by Andrew Scheer today on his comments.
It was.
The focus for myself, for our government, is to give women a real choice. The Canada Child Benefit, lifting women out of poverty, education, increasing women's labor force participation rates. Let's provide a real choice on this debate. Thank you.
David?
Thank you. Of all the federal parties, only the People's Party allows its candidates and future MPs to openly discuss and bring forth legislation on any issue of concern to Canadians, including abortion and euthanasia. In our support of freedom of expression and freedom of conscience, we stand alone. Even the federal Conservative Party, at one time the protector of conservative values, has abandoned those values completely. Andrew Scheer, mimicking the words of Justin Trudeau, has repeatedly insisted, quote, he will oppose any attempt by his social conservative backbench to reopen the abortion file. Well, be they candidates or citizens, the People's Party of Canada will not allow the moral convictions of law-abiding Canadians to be censored and outlawed. In fact, already, colleagues of mine from Red Deer, Alberta, have draft legislation to end third trimester abortion, and they will bring it forward as a private member's bill.
And Turcotte.
The law is that a woman has the right to choose, and the concern is that people don't want to see pregnancies terminated. So what should we do? We should go back and look at the root cause, and there are two root causes. One of them are unwanted pregnancies, and the other root cause is a potentially unhealthy pregnancy. And as some of my colleagues have stated, there are ways to mitigate those risks and mitigate those problems. Education for women, education for men so that sexual assaults go down and rapes go down. How about that? We need access to universal pharmacare, which is something that we have put forward so that women are able to access birth control measures. But we also need access to medical care for women in compromised communities. And one of the reasons why is we're talking about voluntary loss of pregnancy, but what about if the baby is ill, or what about if the mother is ill? We could have prevented those with better medical care for those women, and we need to look at those solutions so we can stop it from happening.
Garnett.
Pope Francis would not be allowed to run as a Liberal or NDP candidate. Catholic organizations helping refugees and the poor have been denied government funding for refusing to endorse the status quo on abortion. Like with St. Thomas More, silence is not enough. Liberals opposed our amendments to their euthanasia law, which would have protected conscience rights. Francesco voted against that. So at the moment, physicians here in Ontario are obliged to refer for abortion and euthanasia. We live in a country where most political parties aren't just pro-choice, but they want to drum those who disagree out of public life, out of professions, and out of government programs. Conservatives will defend freedom of speech and conscience for all, including for legislators. Pro-life candidates are free to run and to speak their mind as long as they win competitive nomination races. And pro-life and pro-choice Conservatives have always been united in calling for conscience protection, in opposing the summer jobs values test, and in supporting legislation protecting unborn victims of crime when a pregnant woman is attacked. Thank you very much.
But first, let me say, and Garnett, Mr. Scheer has said that he's not going to open the abortion debate, right? So what you were saying does not entirely jibe with him then not opening. Well, you can say, I'm sure everybody else will press you on that because they're already nodding. But I would say generally, and to Mr. Scheer I would add, if not Garnett, abortion is really probably, I would say, the single biggest issue for most Catholics. And none of you have been able to really give, although Garnett tried valiantly, you haven't given much comfort to the Catholics in the room. And I'm wondering why then any of them should be voting for you. Any of you. All right, I'll let Garnett go first because I picked on him, but short, Garnett, please.
Well, I'll start, but I hope I'll be able to respond to all
David
the
and
things
then
they said.
Francesco.
So I think folks have to recognize where we are, and I think what is critical for our party is that unlike the others, unlike the other major parties, unlike the other parties who will be electing MPs in this election, we will stand for people's fundamental rights to express themselves. We will protect freedom of conscience. And of course, our party leader has said that we will focus on issues that unite us, but individual members of Parliament can be pro-life, can speak about being pro-life, can speak at the March for Life, can express their points of view. And those freedoms, not just for MPs, but also for civil society, so that if you run a Catholic charity, you don't have to check a box saying you're pro-choice before you can access that funding. We need to protect that space for civil society, and we will do that.
I want to go back to the parties and the votes. And as I understand it, and this may have changed because as the campaign goes on, things do, but Mr. Scheer, I thought, would allow private members' bills on abortion, but he wouldn't allow them to come to votes in the House of Commons, which is kind of like having your cake and eating it too.
I'm sorry, Don, but that's not the case at all. Further, it's not even within the power of the leader to prevent a vote from coming.
You could introduce an abortion bill banning abortions or third trimester, whatever, and if it was a private member's bill and it made its way through the process, which isn't all that easy as you know, but if it did, it could come to a vote in the House, and would it be an unwhipped Conservative vote?
Our party policy is clear and our leader has been clear. Members are free to put forward legislation, and I'm going to finish what I say, sir. And if you learn more about our policy, you might have stayed with us, because our party is committed to freedom of conscience for its members and protecting it for everyone. There will be a free vote for every member of our caucus if that issue is everyone, as has always been in the case and as has been our party policy since the party was founded.
Can you clarify today whether backbench MPs will be able to introduce motions or bills on issues touching on abortion or same-sex marriage, and if you would allow a free vote for both your caucus and cabinet on such matters?
Well, I've always been very clear, and nothing has changed for our party on this issue. This is the same, we operate under the same policies as the previous Conservative government under Stephen Harper, which is that individual MPs have the right to express themselves on matters of conscience, but that a Conservative government will not reopen these divisive social issues. And so that is our position. That has always been our position. Canadians can have confidence that these issues will not be reopened under a future Conservative government.
Don, if I understood, and I think if Garnett was dancing, he'd be getting an A+ right now, dancing around the issue. Garnett, are you saying you would reopen the abortion debate in Canada, yes or no? I think you just said yes, Garnett.
Well, our leader has been clear that a Conservative government will not reopen the issue, and that individual members of Parliament will have their freedom of conscience protected. I think that's very clear, that members are able to speak.
Directly contradicts what you just said about 2 minutes ago.
No, it doesn't at all. A Conservative government will not reopen the issue, and individual members of Parliament will be free to be pro-life, to speak about their perspective on that issue, and to advocate as they wish.
Okay.
Matthew.
Well, I think this is a great example of how we can foster respectful dialogue. And I think that part of the issues, I actually reject the premise of your statement that Catholics will only vote on this one issue alone. We've talked about many issues. And I believe that we're in a systems failure right now because we had the opportunity to provide for democratic reform in this country. It was something that the Liberals ran on repeatedly. And it's my belief that if we had run on democratic reform, then we wouldn't be looking for the wedge issues that would allow 38% of the population to have 100% of the power, or to allow the rise of right-wing rhetoric to kind of take this populist bent. And so, my question is to my friend from the Liberal Party. With all of the promises that you gave in 2015 that could have perhaps gotten you out of this conversation tonight, would you be willing to stick to your word and actually reintroduce electoral reform so that we don't get caught in these wedge issues?
Well, you may hear from him in a moment, but David, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you, Don. We keep hearing my rhetoric categorized as right-wing. It used to be just called conservative values. And I fear that if we continue to allow ourselves to be characterized as some kind of demonic force simply because we have moral convictions that are at odds with the dominant political elites, we will lose our voice completely. Related to Andrew Scheer and the clarity or not, if he is clear, he really should begin suing all of the newspapers that are printing his words that say he is just not going to open this issue. And to be fair, I don't know what your position is, pro-life or pro-choice. But the truth of the matter is, if you are fair-minded, you will see that people of different views from yourself should be able to voice their opinion without discrimination. And that is what my party is for. And that is why my party allows free votes. And that is why my party allows us to bring forward legislation on moral convictions that are important to our constituents.
So where were the moral convictions of the leader of your party, who was a conservative for all of these years and only had a coming to Jesus moment when he lost the leadership?
Okay, 30 seconds
You act
to
like
Garnett.
he's brand new.
Thank you.
30 seconds to Garnett, and then we're moving on.
May I? Thank you.
30 seconds.
Okay. I think this is where we need to calm things down a little bit and stop talking about how terrible each other's leaders are and actually judge this through compassion. Let's think about the actual women that we're talking about. So if the laws are in place, what can we do to help the women? And what we need to help those women. We need to promote their health and their safety and their education so that they don't end up in broken situations. We've got to stop with this craziness and start looking out for the people of Canada. Yes, and we need to reduce those abortions by looking out for those women and for the health and safety of the women and those children.
Excuse me, time is up. That was a very good question, but I don't want anybody else to follow. I'll do the questions, otherwise we'll be here all night, which is kind of entertaining, I agree, and informative, but we can't stay. All right, let's move on to our fourth topic, and that is newcomers. And let's hear our question, and let's watch it on the big screen.
I'm Deacon Rudy Ovjak, Director of the Office for Refugees at the Archdiocese of Toronto, Canada's largest private refugee sponsor. We're here at the ORAT offices. Over the past decade, the Archdiocese of Toronto has welcomed more than 4,500 refugees to Canada. And this was only made possible by the generosity of many people who have given of their time, talent, and treasure to come to the aid of those who have had to flee from their homeland because of violence and persecution. The Catholic Church, along with many faith communities across the country, have led the way in private sponsorship of refugees, a program that has become the envy of the world. Yet it faces significant challenges. Our office sponsors refugees from many faith traditions, both Christian and non-Christian. However, I am deeply concerned that the United Nations, along with many Western governments, including Canada's, have done far too little to address the suffering of Christian refugees. As Carl Haytu has already told us, Christians are the most persecuted religious community in the world. Christians are being bullied, arrested, jailed, expelled, executed, and oftentimes the targets of genocide. This should have triggered an overwhelming response from the West. Yet in July, a report that was commissioned by the UK Foreign Secretary to examine Christian persecution found that the West has done little to address this issue. In fact, by all accounts, Christians are terribly underrepresented in refugee resettlement efforts undertaken by the West. My question is, what actions will your government take to ensure that there is justice and equity within Canada's refugee resettlement program, so that persecuted religious minorities, and in particular the Christian community, are not abandoned?
Thank you, Deacon Rudy. 1 minute each for the candidates. And Garnett, would you go first?
Well, thank you. Newcomers succeed when we welcome them into our own homes and communities. Government must play a role, but it's not for politicians to claim the limelight. So the question for this segment is how we can better support you in the work you know best and are already doing to welcome newcomers. The question is deeply personal for me because my grandmother was a refugee. Conservatives will lift caps, reduce wait times, and strengthen the support to private refugee sponsors. These refugees enrich the communities they join and have a demonstrably higher rate of success as a result of better community support. Over the last 4 years, unfortunately, the rhetoric on immigration has been out of step with reality. Sponsors, including this archdiocese, have faced arbitrary cuts to their quota allocation along with new red tape. Vulnerable refugees who already have sponsors in hand can still be forced to wait for 3 years or more. In government, Conservatives supported communities in welcoming 240,000 legal immigrants every year. We also maintained high levels of public support for immigration. So it's time to get our system back on track.
Dan Turcotte from the Green Party. Dan.
I certainly agree. It's time to get our system back on track. And I also think that we need more immigration. And we're going to see a lot more refugees, not just because of unrest, but climate refugees. We're already starting to experience an influx of climate refugees, and believe me, that's not going to get any better if we don't address the climate crisis. Of course, I have to say that because I believe it wholeheartedly. You know, we're also going to need a lot more workers to handle green jobs as we transition our economy. And I know that seems to be a nasty word in some places, but we are going to have to transition our economy. We're on the verge of a new technological and industrial revolution right now, and we have to be ready for that. And those immigrants can actually help us with that workforce. So the Green Party feels that we need to expand immigration and we need to make sure that it is fair, absolutely. I'll just close by saying, because I'm out of time, that we as Canadians have so much, we have enough to share. So let's share, let's be kind.
Francis.
Thank you, Don. I'd like to first go back to say thank you to Cardinal Collins and everybody at the Archdiocese for their leadership on the Syrian refugee file. Again, that was a moment for Canadians to be proud of, and we continue to work to accept refugees coming to Canada, to integrate, to work, and to live a better life. One thing that I'm very proud of is the Global Refugee Sponsorship Initiative that our country took to train other countries in adopting refugee sponsorship programs. 6 countries have started to implement the refugee sponsorship program, and 12 other countries are working to adopt a similar model. We will be quadrupling the number of privately sponsored refugees to 20,000 by 2020, increase caps on SARs, or sponsorship agreement holders, to facilitate more private sponsorships. But we also have to ensure that the rhetoric, especially from the far right and the Conservatives on this issue, is down. Refugees are our most vulnerable people in the world. We need to assist them where we can and help them. That is the Canada that I know. Thank you.
Matthew.
If you can hear the compassion in my voice when I talk about this topic, it's because it's personal. You see, my people were this country's first Christian refugees. My people were freedom seekers who walked the footpaths of the Underground Railroad and risked everything to follow that North Star to this promised land. The first refugees of this country. Canada has a long tradition at its best of being a welcoming place for those seeking refugees from war and violence and simply seeking a better life for themselves and their families. In a time when immigrants are demonized and targeted by violent rhetoric, we have the responsibility to welcome those who come to Canada with generosity and kindness. Our immigration system is largely a success story across the world, but we should end the safe third-party agreement to ensure that asylum seekers are treated fairly and respectfully here in Canada, and work to address the serious backlogs for family reunification.
David.
Thank you. I just want to show that it doesn't always have to be partisan up here. My Conservative colleague, when he says that we need to emphasize private sponsorship, that too is a policy that we have embraced in the People's Party because it does work very well. Churches and communities of faith have been phenomenal in sponsoring refugees, and we need to do more of that, and less of the government sponsorship, which actually doesn't work out. We also need to fix the refugee system generally. What people may not know is that Canada, since 2017, has brought in more refugees than any other Western country, even 10 times more than the United States. I'm sorry, that's wrong. More than the United States, that has 10 times our population. But my point is this: we have not focused on those who have been persecuted. 40% of the people who have come into Canada through Quebec have been rejected. 40%. We don't need people gaming the system. We need to treat those people who are really in fear for their lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, I asked you not to applaud, but I actually am enjoying you applauding. What I'm not enjoying, though, is there are some people in the audience who are flashing things and trying, it seems to me, to distract some of the candidates when they're speaking. They don't enjoy that, and I really don't enjoy it. And I doubt the Cardinal enjoys it either, although I haven't actually consulted with him. But I'm asking you now to please stop it. Now, let's go on with I want to talk about the private sponsorship of refugees. Private groups that want to sponsor refugees, what hand do they have in selecting who those refugees are, or do they basically just sponsor people that have gotten into the queue and we're moving the queue along faster because we have some private sponsorship? David, why don't you go first?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Well, currently we rely on the UN for many of the refugees that come to us. The People's Party government wants to make sure that we have instead aid groups on the ground who know the people that are coming to them, and they're going to be more intricate. What we want to do is make sure that we have face-to-face interviews with the people so that we can actually know what their story is. We want to be able to take a more personal approach. We also think that it's important that we get out of the UN Compact for global migration because it actually hamstrings Canada in its ability to make its own decisions.
So just yes or no, say this archdiocese should have people where, in Africa or the Middle East, and they should be picking the people? When you said we should have people on the ground, is that what you meant?
What I mean is if the archdiocese has people on the ground already, then we would leave it to their expertise.
Francesco, same question to you. Should private groups sponsor people that are already basically in the queue just to move the queue along faster, or should they be somehow in the selection process?
My understanding in working with ORAT and other private sponsorship agreement holders on the private sponsorship of refugees, they work all over the world. They have expertise, whether it's in Africa or the Middle East or, say, Myanmar or in Iraq or Jordan, Lebanon, and they have expertise on the ground, and they have their numbers or their quota, if you want to utilize that word, where they can bring refugees to Canada, and they're great partners with the Canadian government, and they have been for decades.
Garnett, what would you do, what would a Conservative government do about the asylum seekers that show up on the Quebec border and basically just walk into the country? How do you feel about that?
Well, we think that's a problem. We think we need to focus on the world's most vulnerable refugees who aren't necessarily those folks seeking asylum from upstate New York, which is why our approach would be to change the tone and make sure we're clear about the way our rules work. We would seek to renegotiate aspects of the Safe Third Country Agreement that encourage people to make crossings at dangerous points. And I think, we see some polarization on questions of immigration. Conservatives believe that we can manage the system better, that we can address the problems that exist in the system, and we can welcome more of the world's most vulnerable refugees through private sponsorship. And I wanted to just answer your earlier question about the process, because really there's a two-step screening process, right? The private sponsor groups will identify individuals who are vulnerable, and very often there's a personal connection. It might be through a diaspora community or some other connection that facilitates that welcoming and integration process. But then there's also a government review. So you have that extra review and that personal connection that facilitates integration, which is a much better way of ensuring success than the increase in asylum claims we've seen under the Liberals.
And there's also a very important point here. I reject the framing of that question as though they just cross the border and walk into the country. That's not so. What they do is present themselves at the border to the RCMP, after which they are taken for indefinite detention until they're processed, without representation sometimes. So I don't want to give the audience here some view, this Maple Wash perspective, that people walk through the snow risking their limbs and are just welcomed with a Tim Hortons coffee and a welcome into the country. That's not how this works. They are not illegal.
I agree with you.
Excuse me, I need to finish this point.
Well, no,
they are not illegal.
I am moderating,
they are irregular.
and I think, speaking to your point, which is that they are detained and they are
you said welcomed
taken in. Well,
it's not a fair assessment, sir.
Okay. Well, I'm not running anywhere, and don't you think it's a pretty darn good thing I'm not? Dan, last word to you.
I'm going to keep my answer really short because I think a lot's been said here. One of my colleagues actually said that it's important that we reduce wait times. I think that's very, very important. I also think that a lot of the private sponsorship that happens is absolutely wonderful. My brother is a reverend, and he actually his church sponsored a number of Syrian refugee families and did some wonderful work, and I commend them for that. But I do think that it is our responsibility to make sure that the immigration process is fair, and so we need to look at where those refugees are in the most dire need, and we need to make sure that their immigration needs are being fairly represented, and we need the government to preside that in case private sponsorship doesn't cover all of that.
All right, let's move along to our final topic, and that is the environment and climate change. And let's hear our final question.
I'm Jeff Cole, and I'm a teacher at Patrick Fogarty Catholic Secondary School in Orillia.
And I'm Emerson Garces, and I'm a grade 11 student at Patrick Fogarty. I'm not old enough to vote in the federal election on October 21st, but I am concerned about a number of important issues, such as the environment and climate change.
I teach a class for high school seniors that challenges them to be environmentally conscious citizens. I don't want my students to feel helpless about the state of our environment, so I show them that there are tangible things they can do to make the world a better place, like working with local conservation groups. As a Catholic teacher, it was important for me to hear Pope Francis call on us to respond both to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor in his papal encyclical, Laudato Si.
Mr. Cole's class got me thinking about how environmental damage could impact our planet for generations to come. I had opportunities to test lake water in Orillia and to research how mercury pollution in northwestern Ontario rivers has affected the people's lives in Grassy Narrows First Nation.
When you hear that Canada is only responsible for about 1.5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, it makes our role in this global problem seem small. However, Canada is also the 9th largest carbon emitter in the world, and we have the highest carbon emissions per capita among G20 countries, which I think raises the question, are we called to be international leaders in addressing climate change?
If elected, what would be your party's top priority for ensuring that my generation will have a healthy environment in the decades to come?
Wow. Thank you, Emerson, and thank you, Jeff. 1 minute for each debater, and Garnett, you go first this time.
Well, thank you, Jeff and Emerson. So in this area, there are points of agreement and of disagreement. Stephen Harper's government set greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, which have also been endorsed by Justin Trudeau as our Paris targets, and Mr. Bernier was a part of that previous government. So we've all bought in to some extent, or some of us, to the same targets as far as 2030. But we disagree on the best way to get there. The Liberal approach imposes a carbon tax on everyday Canadians, small businesses, and even churches, while giving a break to large emitters. That is neither effective nor just. The Conservative plan at ourrealplan.ca is detailed and comprehensive. It proposes major tax credits and incentives for new technology investment. Key measures include a generous green homes renovation tax credit, a transit tax credit, and major incentives for green technology. Climate change is a global problem. Pushing investment outside of Canada through higher taxes will not improve the situation. Good stewardship means harnessing our creative potential through incentives which allow both individuals and companies to adapt.
Thank you. Matthew, you're next.
The most sacred time of my day is when I put my son down to sleep. I think about the future he's about to inherit. I think about the fact that there are 11 years left until the impacts of catastrophic climate change become irreversible. So in order to reduce emissions by the amount that the science best says that we need a plan that takes the scale of the climate crisis seriously, but also takes the challenge of keeping communities whole just as seriously, which is why our plan is focused on supporting the communities through a just transition to zero emissions economies. We will create 300,000 climate jobs for our plans for green investment, will make life more affordable for families, and will leave no region in this country behind. A plan that does not account for the keeping of the social fabric of our country intact is a plan that will also fail the planet. And for those of you who do not believe in climate change, just know that on the west we have fires and on the east we have floods. Climate change is very real.
David Haskell from the People's Party.
Well, thank you. And thank you for a great question, because it says, what will be the top priority? And the top priority for a People's Party government will be clean water for Indigenous communities. That is going to be our top priority. And then we are also going to look at, based on the evidence, what are the most pressing environmental needs for Canadians? And we already know what that is. Health Canada says that over 14,000 people in North America die annually from air pollution from human sources. We also see that pollution in our lakes, rivers, and ocean, they cause hundreds of cases of illness every year. So we're going to make those our priorities. First, clean water for Indigenous communities, also clean air and clean water. Now, the other parties sometimes categorize us as climate deniers. That's not the case. But we have seen a difference of opinion based on the science. We think that there's room for doubt.
Dan Turcotte.
I'm not sure I think there's room for doubt. And asking a Green Party person to give our climate policy in 1 minute is a little tough. So I'm going to rattle a couple off here.
That's why you're not going last.
First of all, we need to end our dependency on fossil fuels. And we need to end our subsidies for fossil fuel holders. And we need to start moving our economy into a newer, greener economy. This is a great opportunity to create new jobs. And by the way, there are far more emerging jobs in green technologies right now than there are in antiquated industries like oil, okay? We need to expand our east-west energy grid. That is going to be a massive thing. And by the way, it's a great thing when you can fill your car up for $6 worth of electricity instead of $70 worth of gas. Most importantly, we need to be a leader in the world stage, and this is one thing that I saw there that really inspired me. We are terrible polluters, and yet we are stewards of some of the greatest biodiversity. We have more lakes than any other country in the world. We have the most beautiful country, and we need to be leaders and use our technology to lead others out of it.
Francesco.
Thank you. There is no plan B for Earth, for God's Earth, as the French leader said a few months ago. There is no plan B. We need to take action on climate change, and we are. We introduced a price on pollution. Many years ago, Ontario decided to close all its coal plants. Canada is a leader and will be a leader and continue to be a leader on this file. Whether it's through innovation, putting a price on pollution, encouraging electrical vehicle usage throughout Canada, unlike the cuts that were done in Ontario recently, we will continue to be a climate change leader. And it was interesting to note, when 500,000 people marched in Montreal again on climate change, there was only one federal leader that didn't show up. Who was that? Andrew Scheer. Most pressing issue that His Holiness has identified for politicians, and Andrew Scheer didn't show up. Thank you.
Let us have a little debate here. This is the last one. I'll come to you second. Garnett, I want you to comment on Mr. Scheer not being there, but also on his idea that there should be these energy corridors across the country, and his support of pipelines, not just the Trans Mountain Pipeline, but other pipelines, which leads some people, and obviously Francesco was alluding to it, to think that he's not serious about global warming and greenhouse gases and climate change the way perhaps other parties are.
Well, first of all, I'd say we have the same targets and we have a better plan. Now, Francesco talked about Trudeau going to a protest in Montreal, but as we've seen with this Prime Minister, just because he wants to put on a color or an appearance, it doesn't necessarily reflect the reality. Now, he met with Greta Thunberg. She told him he wasn't doing enough. He went to the protest, which was against his government's policy. He's trying to lead a protest. We're trying to lead a country back on track. And let me say, when it comes to energy corridors, I'm very proud to be part of a party that supports pipelines, which are the most effective and environmentally friendly way of getting our resources to market, because it doesn't make sense for us to be importing Saudi oil at world prices into Eastern Canada when we could be putting Canadians to work in the most innovative energy sector in the world. I'm proud of our energy sector, and we can move forward with energy development while using technology to improve the environment as well.
Do you think Mr. Scheer would have been wise to have gone to the parade?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you because the audience was clapping. And that's not a line. I really couldn't hear you.
I couldn't hear me either. It was terrible. Do you think Mr. Scheer was wise, or if he woulda, coulda, shoulda, he would have gone to the parade?
Well, I just don't think it's about whether or not you go to a parade. I mean, people understand that about Justin Trudeau.
Well,
he wants to be at every parade. He wants to be at every parade. But he doesn't do the work, right? He just doesn't do the work.
Every parade, no parade. You had your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks, Don. So I made the comment at the end of my 1 minute. I said that I have doubts, and I just want to quickly show you why I might have doubts. So my colleague from the NDP said that we are facing something about droughts. It was either global droughts, or the idea was that cataclysmic droughts. So I want to just tell you about the peer-reviewed science on this. A 2014 paper published in the premier science journal Nature showed conclusively that the percentage of the globe in drought between 1982 and 2014 was significantly lower, not higher. And it stopped in 2014 because that's when the study was published. I'll also say that the science is very clear. Levels of CO2 in the atmosphere didn't reach concentrations great enough to affect global warming until the 1960s. But global warming, as the scientists tell us, began in the 1800s. For something to be the cause, it cannot come after the effect. There are numerous studies that are similar to this, but they just are not allowed to be spoken. And if we really want to move forward with a climate change strategy or an environmental strategy that is effective and helps the most Canadians, right now, we have to look at all sides. And some science can't be taboo.
Francesco.
Thank you, Don. Climate change is real. Climate change is happening. And we see it all over the world. To shy away from it, to criticize leaders that decide to attend a rally, to fight against climate change. You folks may laugh, but climate change is happening and we need to take action on it. And that's what we're doing. Yes, we can grow the economy. Yes, we can help the environment. And that's what we're doing. We need to lead a clean environment for our kids and a healthy environment for our children, for future generations. We can't just walk away from the fight against climate change. Yes, innovation is happening and companies all over the world are marching to this and adopting new technologies to fight climate change. We see it every day. But to say, oh, it's not happening, or the science isn't real, or to abdicate leadership on the position like the Conservatives want to do, that just doesn't work. That's not leadership.
Francesco, the audience wasn't laughing at
Wait
the issue.
a minute.
They were laughing at your leader's two planes.
Matthew's turn now. Matthew,
we
go ahead.
We need to be clear. There isn't some science. There is just science and the facts. But the challenge is the facts still remain that you can't be a climate champion and buy pipelines. And if you're going to spend $10 billion to nationalize a pipeline, why wouldn't you spend that same money to nationalize housing? The fact is that the Liberal government has only allocated $2.5 billion to social housing. So all the things that were listed earlier are a clear example of where this government's priority lies, which is always in the interests of big businesses and big corporations. They govern for the rich and not the rest of us.
Dan, I saw a chart recently, it's about a year old, that said that the world is powered 85% by fossil fuels, the whole range of them, and about 15% by alternate energy, tidal, wind, solar. You talk about, and the NDP too, and to some degree the Liberals, that these new technologies are coming on and that they will create jobs and provide energy and so forth. It seems to me that it's awfully slow in the way it's coming on, and that you're pretty optimistic, and I would say, are you over-optimistic in thinking that these are going to replace fossil fuels anytime in the near future?
I hope they do replace fossil fuels sometime in the near future. I think one of the reasons why they're slow is because we're still subsidizing oil, which is just a massive, massive industry. Those subsidies should be going elsewhere toward forward technologies. But I'd actually like to jump to a couple of other things that some of my other colleagues here said. Questioning climate change and questioning the science, something that we need to consider is that climate change affects our food security. Now, I actually own a hobby farm. I grew up in a farming community. I'm going to give you an anecdote from 2 hours away in southern Ontario, where a bunch of my fellow farmers, who, by the way, are all lifelong Conservatives, came up to me and said, oh, you're running with the Green Party. Can you bring the bees back? We're having pollination problems. If you don't have pollination, you don't have food. And if you don't have food, you don't have a future. These are real problems, and they're imminent, and they're here now, and we can choose not to believe it, but it's better to deal with it now than deal with it when it's too late. I really think we need to take a serious look at this.
Well, time has moved along, and gentlemen, it's time for closing statements. And remember I told you at the beginning that you could be thankful and encouraging to candidates when they finished their closing statement. You decided to go ahead on your own anyway and disregarded me. I was thinking of canceling your appreciation now, but I realized I'd be even less successful at that than I was previously. So you can applaud again after each one has spoken. 1 minute each, just 1 minute for the closing statements. And David Haskell from the People's Party, you are first.
Thank you very much. Maybe over the course of this evening, you thought to yourself, I like what I'm hearing about the People's Party, but they're new, and if I vote for them, is my vote going to count? I want you to think of that in context. If you voted for the Liberals in the last election, your vote was wasted. Yes, they got in, but your vote was wasted because Justin Trudeau broke almost every promise he made, but doubled down against his ideological foes. Regarding the Conservatives, they've become ashamed of all things conservative. You can support them, but they won't support you. Vote for them and your vote is wasted. As for the NDP and the Greens, I believe their ideas would lead to the greatest restrictions on our freedom. So in this coming election, don't waste your vote. Instead, cast your vote on the waters of political change. And with the People's Party, a revitalized Canada will return to you. Thank you.
And now, Francesco Sorbera for the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to my fellow candidates for being here this evening, to the Archdiocese for organizing. Elections are about choices. Choices on what type of country we want to continue to build, about the society that we are in this world that we're blessed to live in. I believe in a diverse country. We are diverse, but it is our choice to be inclusive. And that is something that we have championed for the last 4 years, and that is something that we'll continue to champion. An inclusive Canada, a compassionate Canada, a Canada that continues to lift children and their families out of poverty, a Canada that continues to be the role model for the world and creates good paying middle-class jobs for all Canadians, over 1.2 million or nearly. A Canada that I'm proud to live in, and a Canada that my daughters and their classmates will inherit long after our time. That is the country I choose to live in. I'm blessed. We are all blessed to live in this country. And safe travels to everybody home this evening, and God's blessings. Thank you.
Garnett Genius from the Conservative Party.
All of my comments from tonight and other resources are online at catholicconservative.ca. There was a former mayor of New York City who said, if you agree with me on 9 out of 12 issues, vote for me. And if you agree with me on 12 out of 12 issues, see a psychiatrist. This is a critical choice in this election, and you're not going to agree with any party on everything. But the choice is 4 more years of Justin Trudeau or the Conservative alternative. And that choice really matters. It matters because we will fight for conscience protection so that Catholic doctors aren't run out of the profession. It matters because we will restore the office of religious freedom. It matters because we will cut the lowest marginal tax rate. Francesco said that cutting the lowest marginal tax rate helps the rich. That's ridiculous. The benefit of that tax cut caps out at $45,000 a year. It means that fewer border crossers and more of the world's most vulnerable private refugees will come to Canada. It means that matters that Catholic charities will no longer be denied access to government programs on the basis of their convictions. Again, please check out more resources at catholicconservative.ca where you can find all of these points as well. Thank you.
Now, Dan Turcotte from the Green Party.
I'd actually like to close by quoting the last video we saw where they said it's our responsibility to be leaders. I think we need to really take that to heart. I think that's what we're here for. So let's be the generation that did something incredible for the future generations. And let's be selfless. Let's be the selfless ones. And remember that when you vote, if you want things to change, you have to vote differently. So even if your vote doesn't win a seat, it will still make a statement. And by the way, you're probably going to end up with a minority government regardless, so it's a really good time to vote Green. Most importantly, I would urge you, as per the tone of this conference, to vote in a way that shows caring for the future generations. We've spoken so much about unborn children. Let's not just think about the unborn children from right now. Let's think about them all for the next 100 years and what's going to help every one of them. Thank you.
And Matthew Green now from the NDP.
In the spirit of difficult conversations and respectful dialogues, I'm actually going to do something unorthodox. I'm going to set aside my clothes and instead give topics to a group in this country that have been silenced on this stage. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement that we are actually gathered here on the ancestral territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people, given with the dish with one spoon. I would like to acknowledge that this week was Orange Shirt Day, that every child matters, and that we believe that reconciliation is a path that must be walked together in partnership with Indigenous peoples. And we would work to establish a National Council on Reconciliation and a National Action Plan on Reconciliations with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people across this country. The fact remains that there are actually more people in care, Crown care, today than ever under residential schools. And the fact is that after the last 5 years, there have been 102 deaths of Indigenous, First Nations, and Métis people. And this is something that we need to address, and this is something that I hope, as a Catholic faith community, you will also take part in as reconciliation.
All right, let's give all the candidates a round of applause. And thank you, candidates, for being so engaging. And thank you in the audience for being so engaged.